Hi, Sachsenhausen. Polonia gwarna, parna, Germania richtig dicker Heil. Sachsenhausen. Wirtycie jak bambusik, trupie łebki to kaktusy heil. Es lebe kule der Kampf.
Welcome to Descendant Stuff, a podcast by and for the descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners, working together to uncover the unanswered questions of its history. Sachsenhausen was a Nazi concentration camp located in Oranienburg, Germany, used from 1936 through April 1945. It was used as a labor camp, with a network of subcamps and worksites around the region, as well as a prison camp, death camp, medical experimentation center, and SS training ground. It was also the administrative center for all Nazi concentration camps. We are Jakob, Kelsey, and Nicole, three descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners. Though our relatives were imprisoned for different reasons, we've discovered we have much in common. In each episode, we interview other descendants, researchers, and even survivors, sharing stories, memories, and research to build a clearer picture of the past, one that goes beyond the records. Through these conversations, we honor those who suffered and died at Sachsenhausen and strengthen our collective understanding of our own ancestors' experiences.
Today, I have the opportunity to speak with Robert Sommer, cultural scientist, historian, social scientist, writer, and author of the book The Concentration Camp Brothel, Forced Sexual Labor Under Nazi Rule. In the past 2 years, Sachsenhausen Memorial has held a ceremony to acknowledge the brothel at Sachsenhausen and the women who were forced to work there. Thank you, Robert, for agreeing to meet and tell us more.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. I've been doing this research on the system of camp brothels for quite some time. When I was actually visited Auschwitz for the first time in my lifetime, and that was 2000. And I heard that there was one brothel in Auschwitz, and I actually heard that the brothel was not for the guards as I expected them to be, but for the prisoners, which really shocked me. That was the beginning of a long research. For about 9 years, I visited 70 archives. I did 30 interviews, and I collected all the material I could possibly find on the subject, and I actually found that the subject is highly taboo. It wasn't really talked about in almost none of the memorials. And so I'm very happy actually that some of the memorials now talk about it. Sachsenhausen does, and other Buchenwald does, and Ravensbrück, for instance, also does, because most of the women actually in the brothels were from Ravensbrück, the number one female concentration camp. I came across that. It started to become a very big project. And one of the main goals was also to find the names and information on women who were forced into prostitution in the brothels. There's many more documents on prisoners than you actually think. In Sachsenhausen, not, but in other prisons or camps. And that actually led to the fact that I could talk for more than 80% of the women, in all the women in the concentration camp brothels, in all the 10 camps. I have their names and their background information. So that is a very good base for the research and for also giving information. And so I can say where they're from and how old they were. I sometimes even have pictures or the address of their parents. And this also led to a big project of commemoration last year. We put in the city of Krefeld the first stumbling block, Stolperstein, for a woman who actually was in a brothel in Buchenwald, which was a really big thing. It was Quantensprung, we say in German. It's kind of a new big event. We were able now to finally find a way to memorize those women, to give them back their dignity through showing and giving their names and telling their stories. So I'm very happy that in Sachsenhausen things are developing. There was an artist community that kind of put this little memorial next to the brothel barracks, Les Oubliés, like the Forgotten Women, which I find a very moving sculpture. And also Sachsenhausen, together with some activists, are now trying to getting a memorial plaque or some kind of memorial for the women, together with art students. And I'm also involved in the project, of course.
Can you tell us, just for listeners so that they can imagine, the context of this brothel at Sachsenhausen within the camp? The camp is shaped like a triangle, the geometry of terror. And where was this brothel located within that triangle?
So it was at the very corner of the triangle. I was in the infirmary section, the section the prisoners always avoided, because that was the section where people were dying. Also, sometimes were treated, but also medical experiments were carried out. It was right next to the building, the pathology building, where bodies were dissected just to find gold inside of the body and break out the teeth, golden teeth from their mouth. And right next to that barrack, and actually on top of the morgue, which was extending over, it was just outside of the barracks also. And that's actually where the brothel was built. It was one of the later brothels built in a concentration camp system. The first brothel was actually built in 1942 and then opened. And the last one was actually opened in 1945 in Mittelbau-Dora. And Sachsenhausen was one of the last ones. It was actually opened in August 1944 when things were already coming to an end. And the women in the brothel actually almost entirely recruited in Ravensbrück concentration camp. Also, some women were recruited in some of the sub-camps, Felten, for instance, of Sachsenhausen. And you can already see like the SS tried to find women, and it was hard to find women for that kind of job. And so they tried different ways and trying to find women within the camp system of Sachsenhausen.
So if somebody is visiting where this is located at Sachsenhausen, they would come into Tower A, enter the camp, and take a left and walk along, follow that to get to the pathology lab. And then that building no longer exists, but it's behind that pathology lab in kind of an outline in the ground.
There's actually two outlines. There's one which kind of marks the morgue. You can see how, and then on top of that, there's also like marker of the brothel barrack. Unfortunately, there's no really marker, any official marker there. I've been talking to the memorial for a long time, and I was telling them and asking them. It hasn't happened yet. I'm happy that it happens now. Because it's confusing, it says Sonderbau on it, and nobody knows what Sonderbau is. Sonderbau could be anything.
Sonder means special, so it's a special building.
And Sonder, usually the word Sonder is used in a camp for killing. So Sonderbehandlung means it's like kind of a euphemism for killing people. So Sonderbau, it's the same kind of word, but so people just don't know what it is. But it's interesting, it's right at the corner. There's actually only one picture left. It was taken in 1944, which shows like the fence and the wall and a piece of a barrack, but there's actually no picture of the entire barrack. There's a drawing by the Soviets who took over the camp in 1945. And they drew all the barracks, which were important, and also like to reuse them because Sachsenhausen became a special camp after the war, where they interned or imprisoned former Nazis, but also like people who were against the communists, of course. That building was actually used again. The brothel was used again as a dormitory for personnel from the medical department. So the rooms were single rooms, most of them, because it was a brothel. And because of that, we know exactly where the brothel was located, thanks to that drawing. And we also have a testimony of a woman actually who was in the brothel of Sachsenhausen. And her testimony was in a case of a trial. There was a trial again called the Lagerführer. And after the war, she testified, she told about her story. And she also said, and very briefly, it's just only 2 paragraphs, that she was actually in Sachsenhausen in the brothel. And she explicitly said that she always remembered sleeping on top of these dead bodies because the SS used actually part of the structure, underground structure of the morgue, like the ceiling of the morgue, as a foundation for the building, which was very pragmatic. So basically, women were sleeping on top of the cellar where all these dead bodies were piled. And also the SS used that as a particular space, so attached the brothel barrack to the pathology laboratory. There's various reasons for that. And one is because they saved money, because they didn't have to build a foundation, because they already had one, because of the ceiling of the morgue. But also they could attach like wires and water to the next building. So they were using the pipes and the water from the pathology building. Also because it was a way to totally control the building. And it was barely any prisoner who ever wanted to go there into that area, because that was the area of death. And so the SS had total control over that section. That was probably the reason why they built it in this very far corner next to the infirmary. And it was actually the only camp brothel which was ever built in this position. Very often camp brothels were built even at the side in the corner of the camp, but never really on top of a morgue, which was really the Sachsenhausen case.
Yeah, and that it made such an impression on this woman who in her brief testimony ended up thinking of this. I'm surprised that somebody who worked there actually gave testimony, that we can hear about it from her voice. Because I'm curious about how you researched this and what your sources are. How much of this came from the women themselves or their families?
So I don't have any testimonies from family members of women who were in the brothel. And it's really rare. There's only 2 major or 3 major testimonies of women who actually talked about them having been to a brothel. And Sachsenhausen is one of the few cases where we actually have a small mentioning of it in a trial, actually. But what happened is actually after the war, many women who were inside of the camp, and this actually includes not like every woman in a camp, felt they're part of this liberated camp community of the survivors. And often they spoke about their kind of what happened to them in the camp and what work squad they had to work in. And there was a sense of comradeship among the prisoners and the survivors, because they all felt that kind of they were on the same killing space or torturing space. And this changed very quickly. after the war, because very soon there were politics of commemoration. Some people were excluded from the memory. Some people actually were brought back to prisons. For instance, if you had this criminal prisoners with a green triangle, often they were brought back to a prison where they had to serve their sentence. Antisocial prisoners were never compensated and never included in the memory. And it was actually the Allies themselves, the British and the Americans and the Soviets and the French, who actually decided who are going to be like the prisoners to be compensated. And they said explicitly it's the people imprisoned for racial, political, and religious reasons. So Jews, people who were anti-Nazis, and also Jehovah's Witnesses or even like Catholics or Lutherans. And they were included, but everyone else was not. And that created a massive problem because a big number, even the biggest number of people in the concentration camps were never compensated. And that was all clearly said by the Allies right in 1945. So this kind of developed also into the commemoration politics in Germany, in Eastern Germany as well as Western Germany. So you never had any compensation for certain kind of prisoners, especially the so-called antisocials, the asocial prisoners. And many women actually were in a brothel were German asocials, because prostitutes, for instance, were imprisoned as asocials. And not only that, the society didn't want to hear about this anymore, also legally they're excluded from compensation and from memory, totally excluded. And so it's hard that somebody, a political prisoner, has been remembered, but a woman from a brothel who was sent to Sachsenhausen had never been compensated. And this created a massive problem, which is actually still ongoing. Thanks to the activities of many of activists, there was a law passed a few years ago by the German parliament that now also like the anti-asocial prisoners and the criminal prisoners are now included as victims. But that was something that happened 5, 6, 7 years ago. So very recent, actually. And what you also have to say that women who were in a brothel never could see this or feel this or get any kind of compensation because they had already passed away.
So I think it's helpful just for listeners, especially in the English language, this idea of asocial or antisocial. It's a label that the Nazis created in their own kind of definitions of segregating society racially and hierarchically. Can you explain what that label meant for the Nazis, like how they decided who would be an asocial or an antisocial person?
By terminology, we try to use in German like antisocial rather than asocial, because asocial is really like a negative term used for anyone who's a social outsider. So basically, the Nazis classified people as enemies, and they were political enemies, and they were racial enemies, and obviously they were social outsiders. And social outsiders could be asocial people, as asozial, as they called them. And they could be like people who were imprisoned for small kind of things like theft or minor stuff. And there was a law, actually. In German, it's called vorbeugende Verbrechensbekämpfung.
Like law regarding a protective custody order.
They, instead of being released from a prison, they were sent for detention, for custody, to a concentration camp. That's the legal foundation for that. And that could be almost anyone, especially women who were drunkards, who had too many children, somebody who didn't go to work as often as other people did, somebody who partied a lot, somebody who lived a very private life or like a wild life. Those people, to consider them totally as outsiders today, these people were mostly victims of this kind of law. So they were called asocial. In Nazi Germany, prostitution was not illegal. It was illegal because the Nazis tried to take control over the prostitution system and established a system of brothels all over the country. And they prohibited street walking. Every prostitute who was not registered inside of a brothel was subject to being arrested by the police and could be sentenced to a concentration camp if she was caught 3 times. If a woman was, for instance, a prostitute, did not allow the health departments being checked for STDs twice a week, which was also the law in Nazi Germany for prostitutes, she would be sent to a concentration camp if she missed it 3 times. So that missing 3 times already means they send you to a concentration camp. And I think the problem is also about the terminology, because social has been used today also. Even in German, kids use it as a swear word. They say asocial. That's why we try to say antisocial today. If you look at Tony Blair, the UK in the 1990s, even they passed an asocial law for people who didn't take advantage of the social systems, and they were considered asocial. So you can see the stigmatization of social outsiders is still ongoing today. And that also made it very difficult for them actually to include them into the memory today in Germany.
How did these brothels fit into the Nazi regime of system of control and incentives?
So the brothel system in the camps was built as an incentive system. So what happened is that Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and the head of the master of the concentration camp system, He always felt that the concentration camps should also be some kind of economic enterprise. He wanted to make money with the prisoners. So the idea is he, as the head of the police, of German police, was in charge of detaining people. And so he held them actually in his concentration camps, which he had under his control as head of the SS. So he took prisoners of the state and of the country, of the nation, and put them into this kind of semi-private institution and made them work in factories or in quarries and produced construction material. Like in Sachsenhausen, they would produce bricks. Like the biggest brickwork in entire Europe was planned to build there. It never worked, but at least they planned it. And the idea is, like in the case of Sachsenhausen, Heinrich Himmler wanted to produce the bricks for Albert Speer's reconstruction of Berlin. And he didn't want to just give it to him, he just sold it to him. And the idea is that they have to produce bricks and it's going to be a big money machine for the SS. A money printing machine. The problem is that the efficiency in the camp was so low that Himmler himself thought we need incentives. And he thought, and this is ridiculous, but it's what he decided, that male sexuality is so strong that in the end people will have the incentive to go to a brothel if they just work harder. And that was the plan. The incentives, it's very unique. It never happened anywhere else in Europe actually, or actually in the world, that prisoners in working for the SS or working for some kind of institution, for incentives, they were able to go to a brothel. But this is what he did. He decided, and so he built these 10 brothels in concentration camps. Also, it was possible because prostitution in brothels was actually legal in the Nazi state. So, legally it wasn't a problem. So he could just do it. And so he did.
Can you just describe what was it like when you went into that building? What were the rooms like? I know that in your book, you have photos of not the brothel within Sachsenhausen, but you have photos of Buchenwald and you have plans. Can you describe these architectural plans and then we could look at the photos?
So what they actually did is they were using called a Wehober barrack, a Swiss infirmary barrack. So it had little kind of single bedrooms for kind of people with infections or contagious diseases. And that was easy to use because you had like in the middle of the barrack, you had this corridor. You have this kind of, you walked in there and then on both sides you had these single rooms. And in the end of the barrack, you usually had a dormitory where the women would slept together, or sometimes you had like double rooms where they slept together. And the idea is that it had two big pluses for the SS, this kind of type of barrack, because on one side they could control it easier because they could actually look through spy holes in both sides and the rooms on both sides. But also they could build the building according to the demand of prisoners. So they could have a bigger brothel or a smaller brothel by just like building the barracks longer or smaller. So we do have different sizes. So in Sachsenhausen, the barrack was actually built for 10 prisoners, for 10 women in the brothel. And Auschwitz was a different situation. They planned to have 60 women there. And at one time, actually 20, but 60 altogether. And so other camps, I think they had 18 rooms. So it depends on the size of the camp. They sat down and did the math and said, okay, we have so many prisoners, we need so many women. And so this is actually the way they designed these brothel barracks. There was a standardized barrack, and this Wehober barrack was a standard barrack, also used as an infirmary barrack, but then also later on used as a brothel barrack.
Yeah, so that's very helpful as a layout. And then let's look at some of these photos that are in your book. What stands out to me in these photos is the conditions look very clean. There are vases with flowers set on the tables, not just one vase, but many vases in a room with flowers. There are hanging plants. It looks like a nice place to be, and it almost looks like propaganda photos or something. And I'm curious if you can describe what we're seeing in the photos and also why these photos might have been taken.
So we only have pictures of the brothel of Buchenwald, which was the biggest camp inside of Germany. And the pictures were made by a photographer for the camp commander. He showed his book around, and there were other places in the camp, like the kitchen and the roll call area. All the pictures show a very clean camp. That was a typical propaganda of the SS. The SS always tried to sell the camps as something which was a boot camp. People were reintegrated into the Volksgemeinschaft, the People's Society of Nazi Germany, through hard labor. And that was the idea. And they were taught being orderly and time and so on. And so all the pictures show this very kind of clean camp. So in this book, there's about Buchenwald, there's one page, which has about 7 pictures of the brothel. They all kind of circle around this one kind of headline. This is the brothel of Buchenwald. And you see the main corridor, like the floor in the middle. You also see different kind of rooms. And what I find more shocking, actually, in my eyes, is a dormitory room. So they had in Buchenwald, other than in other camps, like not all the women were staying in one place and one room overnight, but they actually had a double room dormitory. So 2 beds in one room. As you were mentioning the flowers were actually put on purpose there just to make it look nice. If you take away the flowers, it's an empty space and it does not look as nice at all. So this overpresence of flowers, which you probably never ever had there, but just for the pictures. In the case of these dormitory room, you have not only like the bed is made fine, but also you had, 10 flower like bouquets sitting in the room. And you actually have a picture of a German shepherd on the wall as for decorations. So the German shepherd, that's already ridiculous. But what even strikes me most is next to the bed, there's a table. And on the table is a picture of a man, as they were suggesting that women had a normal life outside of the camp. And then they had to do this work because that's their task. And outside all their duty, and then outside of the camp, they go back and have their husband or friend or boyfriend, whatever, or fiancé. And it's just such a ridiculous idea to create this kind of normal situation, which is far away from being normal. And this is actually what strikes you the most in my eyes. And so especially the flowers give the idea that it's a normal place, but it was anything but a normal place.
So we're seeing there's like a common table in the common room, again, with at least 9 bouquets of flowers. And then we can look down the corridor.
They call it Goebbels-Schnauze, like a Goebbels mouth, which is a standard radio in the 1930s. And it's just hanging in there. So it says, it suggests during the daytime, they were having like leisure time and like listening to music. Ridiculous.
Can you describe who could visit these women and what was the system to make all of that work within the camp?
So first of all, there was a very small number of people in the camp. Men actually were able to visit the camp brothel. The SS was very selective about this. Prisoners who were on the upper stratum of the campus society, inside of the camp you had people working in kitchen command or like indoor squads, like in a Schreibstube, like doing the paperwork, capos and floor workers. And those were the men actually who were allowed mostly to go to the brothel. Also, the SS made sure that there's a racial hierarchy. So the Soviet prisoners of war and Jews were always excluded, so they could never go visit the brothel. Mostly it were Germans, like Western Europeans or Northern Europeans, like Norwegians. Also Polish prisoners could visit them. And the SS also makes sure the race laws. In Nazi Germany, you could not have a sexual relationship to a person of another kind of ethnic group. As a German, marrying someone from Japan was almost impossible, and especially between Slavic people and like German people. So because the Aryan race was on top, and the SS in particular was very sure that they didn't want to have any kind of mixture of ethnicities, which is, okay, it's a totally ridiculous thing. But inside of the camp, the SS would even decide who you were able to visit or who you could visit. A male prisoner from Germany could only visit like a German woman. So in Sachsenhausen, we actually had Polish women and German women, but we know by numbers. So then total numbers, I estimate about 17 women in the total time. And at one time, there were 10 women, and usually it was 50-50. So it means actually half of the women actually were able, so half of the Polish men and half of the non-Polish men, the German men, were actually able to go visit the women. So what happened is actually the way that is organized, that a prisoner had to, first of all, ask at the camp commander official permission. And there was a little kind of piece of paper, they had to sign it, and they had to fill it out, and it gave it to the block elder, and the old block elder passed it on to the camp authorities. And then it went on to the camp commander, and the commander decided yes or no. And obviously because, first of all, one is because your ethnic background and your political status. And on the other hand side, also you had to pay for it and you had to have money for this. And the money was like given to you by vouchers for your harder work, or you could also have the money sent from the outside of the camp. So people could actually, your family could send you money. And then actually at the roll call, a list was read out, and it's a number 50,506, a number 70,505 had to wait. And then while all the other people at the roll call in the evening left, those were the prisoners who actually were able then to go to the brothel. And they all marched together, guarded by an SS man. And they marched to the brothel, and at the brothel they were checked again, because often people tried to like sneak in because they weren't allowed, or they were in love with a woman in there and they tried to get to her. And then actually what happens then, the men were all led into a medical room. And they were examined for visible diseases. STDs was one problem, but the other problems were typhus and other diseases. And then also very often in some of the camps, and I think also in Sachsenhausen, they put some kind of cream on their penis. And then actually they had to stand in the corridor in front of the doors. They were addressed to the different doors, and they didn't even know who was inside of the door, who was the woman waiting on the other side. Very often they still had to stand with their pants lowered. So they kind of half naked stand in the room in a line and wait. And so each prisoner were given 10 minutes to go to a woman. So the door would open, they kick the guy inside or let the guy inside and close the door. And through spy holes, the SS was making sure that they could also perform a certain kind of like normal sex, as they call it. So the missionary position was the only position allowed. The men could not stand on the bed with their shoes, they had to take their shoes off, and there were all these regulations. And after 10 minutes, the door opened again, and the SS man like sometimes grabbed the person and kicked them out, and then the next person was going in there. While the woman also meanwhile just had to wash herself with like some soap water. And this is the only hygiene there was for women, and the only contraceptive was washing yourself after the sex. And then basically the men were like let out of the barrack, and that was it. You can see even the term brothel is used. It's nothing but a brothel. It's almost an institution which is of sexual violence, which also goes also into the other direction. It's also demasculizing men. Show a man that they're not men anymore. And in fact, what we know from testimonies, and this is actually, I said before, we have some testimonies of women, 2 women actually, or 3 women actually talked about their time in the brothel, and they were really open about this. And this actually goes along with what some of the male prisoners also say, some of the guys I interviewed, the men I interviewed. And basically, many were not able to do anything. So they were having kind of an erectile dysfunction because obviously being for so long in a concentration camp, they were much better fed than other prisoners, but they were still having hunger and still looking very poorly thin, barely like flesh and bones. And sexual desire was on their side, physically not, that wasn't there. And besides, the situation was nothing but erotic. So basically, many men just never could do it.
So you heard testimony from men who visited these brothels, and that's your source for describing this circumstance that they were in?
As I said, we have women's testimonies, and I was able to do interviews with 5 men who actually admitted to having been to the brothel. 3 of them were actually in Auschwitz, and they're really detailed about their visit to the concentration camp. 1 to brothel. 1 actually visited frequently at the brothel. 1 just 2 times, and 1 just 1 time. And then also I talked to men who actually were young men and went to a brothel once by accident, or they had to deliver laundry to the women and they talked to women and the women gave them bread. And so they remember those women and stuff. So this is the testimony that I was working with. But what was very interesting is that the perception of women in the brothel was very different from each one. So 1 was bragging about it. Like even today, he was like, oh, I was a man and I was young and this woman was beautiful. And so I went there in Auschwitz. And of course, he was also bragging about it because how many people in Auschwitz were able to go to the brothel? I can tell you, it was less than 0.1% of the population. We had a handful of prisoners, maybe 100, maybe 1,000, but the camp had the number of 100,000 prisoners, 30,000 prisoners. Sachsenhausen had 30,000 prisoners, and the number of people who actually went to the brothel are probably not more than 500. So you can see it's a very small number. And finding them was very, very difficult, but through having found 1 in Poland, I found like his friends as comrades, and they survived also, and they also talked about it. So I got like people who kind of were in the same brothel, and they all talked about it. And it was very interesting because I never read any testimony of anybody talking about sexuality in a camp as a man, and especially having a sexual relationship in a camp with someone, especially with a woman, because of course they're called the camp homosexuality, which is a situational homosexuality. Young boys were very often sexually abused by older men in the camp, which was very common. And they never talked about it. I was very happy that those people talked to me about it.
What were the different levels of motivation for male prisoners to use the brothel? Like you talked about some who bragged about it, maybe as a status. And then you also talked about erectile dysfunction. So maybe they knew they had that before they entered. So what might be the different types of motivation for somebody having this experience?
So also like in my book, I analyze this. I talk about different kind of motivations and also try to give like kind of also numbers, like what percentage of the guys went often or who did not. And there's actually a brothel book. It's a list of people who went to the brothel, and it's a little kind of ticks and marks on whenever they went. And it's an entire block. It's from Mauthausen. And thanks to this, we know exactly how many privileged prisoners we had and how many people actually went to the brothel and how frequent they went. We can actually clearly see some people went 1 time only, twice maybe, and some people actually went frequently. And there's actually really massive difference in the motivation. For instance, there were brought as young men to a concentration camp in the age of 18 or maybe 16 even. And then actually in the camp, for the first time, they saw a woman and they never had a sexual relationship before. And so they thought, I'm going to die here. I'm not going to leave this camp alive, but I would like to have a sexual experience before I die. So this is definitely a motivation. We know this. Also, sometimes people wanted to just meet a woman because inside of the camp, the only woman you saw, if you ever saw women, because most of the time in Sachsenhausen, for instance, the women camp was actually open in 44. So until like from 36 to 44, there was basically no women inside of the camp. So these men never saw any women. So the women in the camp were basically like shaved head and looking as prisoners and very often the same as male prisoners. But seeing a woman in a brothel who did not wear this kind of the striped pajamas, who actually smelled good, who was able to wash herself, to put makeup on, to have long hair and civilian clothing, that was something kind of a miracle almost. It's a piece of the outside world inside of the camp. Even though it's all surrounded by violence, and it's all women were not volunteering, they were pushed into this job. But for them, it was the illusion of life inside of a camp. And this became very important, and people must not forget it. So often people would actually go to a camp brothel just not for the sex, but just basically because they wanted to see a woman. I want to talk to a woman and just have for 10 minutes escape from this camp. And this is also a very important motivation. And there's also another one which I like to mention. Some people actually did have like an emotional relationship to women in the camp brothel. So some prisoners said, oh, I want to have a relationship to you. And women actually would agree. They want to have a kind of agreement, a rational relationship, saying you come and visit me, pay other prisoners to not have any sex with me, and I'm going to be your lover. And this actually happened. And this actually happened in all the camps. And we know this from almost all the women, that it was actually a way to survive because women got protection from other men. They did not have to accept other men as much as other women did in the camp brothel. And very often, these relationships even became so emotional that even after the war, they would still meet. And in, I think, 4 cases, I know, but probably more, led into marriage. People actually married. They met in a brothel and married after the war.
That's really interesting. I was thinking as you were talking that men going there went there to feel human, that these women were the tool for them to feel alive in service of that. It took away from these women's humanity in order to make other people feel more human and normal. I'm surprised to hear, and maybe encouraged to hear, that it actually was a mutual relationship in some circumstances that could lead to a relationship outside of the camp.
Yeah, it was actually for me hard to talk about this because we have only the testimony from one side, from the male side, and obviously it's basically saying this woman was in love with me. It's better than saying I had sex with a woman and was forced into prostitution, which made me a perpetrator myself. So of course, it's a protection, like protective narrative. But actually, as we see that happen, that people actually continued having a relationship after the war, because of marriage or through marriage. That kind of really is interesting. And I think it has to do with the fact that if people in the camp, you were surrounded by terror all the time. There were terror and murder, and the only feeling you had was pain all the time. And if you have a kind of a positive emotion, something like friendship, which actually never existed in camps, friendships, yes, did, but everything actually had a price. You always had to pay for something. But even in the camp brothel, you always had to pay for it, of course. Taking the straw, it's the only thing which keeps you alive and also feel alive because you feel as a human being because of your emotions. And if your emotions are eliminated, you're not a human being anymore. And through emotion, people feel alive again. So actually, I call it rehumanization on both sides. Of course, women, they were the most of the victims and they were forced into that. But also, they also used that kind of to survive. It was a survival strategy for them as well. So that's why it was mutual. In some cases, I'm careful about this because very often we have only the male perception of it. But having a wedding, a marriage in the end of it, and having children, maybe that kind of talk says and proves it that they had a relationship. In some cases, also people would meet after the war, and a man and a woman would meet after the war. They had met in a brothel. She went different ways, and he went different ways, and I also know that story. And some case of a prisoner actually who went to, he was actually 2 Polish prisoners, and they were in Auschwitz. She was in a brothel, and he was a very high rank capo. And they met after the war, but of course their ways went different ways, and she stayed in Poland, and he went to Canada. But I don't find it too surprising anymore because it's even, you have also relationships outside of the camp whenever there was a man and woman next to each other. And very often these were very rational. So it's, hey, I like to be with you. I give you some extra bread. And the woman says, oh yeah, thank you. Finally, I got some extra bread. So sure, let's do this. So also there's pragmatic thinking in it. But I think what is very important to understand is that really emotions make us human beings. And it's a kind of a grasping for emotion or trying to find any kind of positive emotion was such a strong thing that, went mutual.
Can you talk about how these women were to take this role in the camp?
So the SS in the beginning means when in 1941 and 42 actually, when the first brothel was opened in Mauthausen. The SS tried to find women who volunteered in parentheses because obviously the conditions in the camp were so bad. The SS tried to find women who were working in outside squads, doing groundwork and really hard work. Almost every woman knew they will not survive this. It's nothing. They cannot survive this kind of job. So the SS would deliberately go to these squads and say, oh, I have a better job for you. And sometimes they would even say, oh, you can serve in a brothel and you get food from the SS, you get a single bed, you have a chance to wash yourself and wear civilian clothing. Also, the SS would promise for women to be released after half a year. This was a false promise. It was never kept. We know this. But also this kind of, if you were in a camp and somebody said you're released after half a year, who wouldn't say yes to it? Of course, some people didn't say yes, especially people who were very religious, right? Catholics in particular. And those people actually said, okay, I'd rather die than doing this kind of work. But some other people said, okay, I want to live. And then there's a very interesting book by Liana Melou, Smoke over Birkenau. And there's a story of a woman of two sisters, and one is in Birkenau and then one is in a brothel in Auschwitz. And then they meet again in the Auschwitz brothel because one has to work in Auschwitz near the brothel, and then there's an air raid. And so they find shelter in the rooms, and she talks to her sister. And then the sister says, if life would have been served to you on a silver tablet, would you refuse it? It's the idea of you have the chance to survive, right? Volunteering for the brothel was one thing, which false promise, but also like the SS would deliberately just like select women. In the very beginning, some women volunteered for this, but a parent volunteered but in the end, there were not enough women actually who wanted to do this anymore. So basically the SS just took women and just 1, 2, 3 and selected them and just brought them to the brothel. And it's not really that it shows like pretty women. It was more like kind of women who were healthy and some kind still visibly women, because of course women were so underfed in the camp and so starving that basically they lost all their secondary sexual features. So basically there was no visible breasts anymore because all your skin was hanging down your body. And the SS tried to find someone who actually looked more like a woman.
So a lot of these women were either lied to get them to come in a false agreement or just forced to be there. How did that affect this victim-perpetrator dynamic between prisoners who visited them and then those women? How they saw each other as victims and perpetrators?
So we know in some cases that men could have had the chance to go there, but they would have never done this because they knew exactly women were forced into that. We know exactly that some people just did not participate in the system, did not want to become perpetrators. Also, sometimes the SS, they promoted this as saying, oh, they went there voluntarily and look at them, they're happy, they have long hair and they live in good conditions. And the conditions were really different from the conditions outside of the camp. If you see how women lived in these barracks and lived in a brothel, it was just like night and day, basically. Also like having food by the SS. So actually there was also jealousy inside of the camp from other women towards women in the brothel. The men actually, there's one case we know from Buchenwald. We had in Buchenwald a very functioning resistance structure. And the structure of the resistance movement, which also led to the overtaking of the camp, just parallel to the arrival of the Americans. The prisoners actually were mostly communist prisoners, and they had a very strong discipline. And they had this rule, as a communist, we do not visit the brothel. We do not visit women because we do not want to become perpetrators. One reason, and the second reason is because they thought the SS is going to use it to finding out secrets about them, because when they're in the brothel, they're easy to talk about everything, whatever. They thought the women would be spies. Actually, so they gave out the rule that no communist in Buchenwald shall visit the brothel. But the head of the resistance movement, Ernst Busse, who was also the capo of the infirmary section of the camp, he was one of the biggest visitors of the brothels. So while most of them never went, some actually did. And he actually went so often. And she had actually one of the women, he brought her for certain kind of reasons. He had fake reasons to bring her over to the infirmary barrack where he was the capo, and had her stay in a room at the infirmary barrack because he wanted to have a sexual relationship to that woman. And they called her Frau Busse in the camp. So Miss Busse, they called her like this. Everybody knew about this. We know on one side that's the order, and then obviously some people just didn't obey the order. It's that kind of George Orwell. Some people are more equal than other people.
And when I'm hearing you say this in Buchenwald and I'm thinking of Sachsenhausen, there was really organized system within Sachsenhausen of political prisoners who had communist beliefs. And so they did have a whole system to work with each other and agreements in the camp. Have you heard anything similar in Sachsenhausen that was like Buchenwald, where there was some sort of agreement or shared thinking regarding the brothel?
No, that's a simple reason for that, because the capos who were running the camp in the very beginning, not running, but they were in the higher positions in the camp and organizing things, were mostly communist prisoners in Sachsenhausen. But this changed very quickly because the SS saw how they were taking position and having control over the camp in some real ways. And also the SS would try to steal stuff from the diamonds and gold, whatever they could steal. And the communist prisoners were a problem for the SS. So they got rid of them and sent them all together to Flossenburg to be executed, to be killed. But they actually survived because the prisoners of Flossenburg did not kill them. That's a very interesting story. I think starting from 1942 on, the majority of the camp capos in Sachsenhausen were actually green triangle prisoners. So they were the criminals, so-called. So Sachsenhausen was actually considered a green camp after that also. So basically, there was barely any kind of communist who was still in the position of going to a brothel because they were not in the higher positions. So mostly criminal prisoners. Some were, but not most of them actually were criminal prisoners. We don't know this about Sachsenhausen. There's one exception. Years ago, there was a German journalist. She wrote a letter to the Häftlings, the Überlebendenverband, so it's the survivors organization of Sachsenhausen. And she asked about the brothel, and there were kind of men who had also lived in the GDR. They're also communists and very kind of old-style Stalinist communist people. And they were very offended that she would ask this question to them. And they wrote about, yeah, it existed, but we don't know anybody who ever went there because we're not in the position that we are communists and we didn't do this. But then they also sent her a voucher for a person saying, this guy is allowed to go to the brothel. And if you check the name and the triangle, it's a red prisoner. So it was a former political prisoner. So of course they went too, right? It's just like they never admitted it. So Sachsenhausen is very different from Buchenwald.
So it's interesting to hear how difficult years afterwards it was for those prisoners to even talk about it or maybe even admit it. And I'm wondering if that just goes back to the recognition that anything happened at all to these women.
So after the war, in particular in Eastern Germany, the subject was completely ignored by survivors. Especially Buchenwald. I always go back to Buchenwald because that was in the main camp where this became a subject after the war as well. Not in Sachsenhausen, because Sachsenhausen was also in the memory of Eastern Germany minor camp. So the main camp for commemorating the crimes of the Nazis and the resistance of the communist prisoners was Buchenwald, because in Buchenwald they had a strong resistance organization. They overthrew the guards, and they had a massive, well-working resistance organization in the camp and run by communists. And Sachsenhausen has never really existed. So Sachsenhausen is a minor camp in the kind of narrative of the camp history in Eastern Germany. The whole narrative in Sachsenhausen was about how the Soviets came and liberate the camp, and they helped us. And that was the story they told us. In Sachsenhausen, so the whole subject was ignored until really the 1990s. There was basically no mentioning of it, even like the late 1990s. I visited Sachsenhausen when I was a child under East Germany, because I was born in East Germany. I lived in East Germany. When I was 14 years old, we went with my class to visit Sachsenhausen. And I went to the pathology building, this barracks where they decided to take the prisoners. And the brothel was right next to it. And I've never would imagine that on top of it was a brothel. There was basically no mentioning at all. Buchenwald was even more difficult because some of the prisoners were communists and they went to the brothel. So there was an investigation of historians in the 1960s, I think. And they wrote a paper on like the history of the brothel of Buchenwald, but they locked it away right away because they knew exactly. They taught it also to the guides in Buchenwald, so they know about the subject, but they were also taught not to talk about it if nobody asked about it. So really, that was not even taboo. It was a political silence. They did not talk about it. So it was even after the 1990s that they talked about it. But then there was another example in the camp of Mittelbau-Dora. That's where they built the missiles, like the V1 and 2 missiles, where Werner von Braun was actually working as well. In that camp was a subcamp of Buchenwald and then became an individual camp itself. In that camp, most of the capos were criminals, and those were also the visitors of the camp brothel. And in some of the publication, it was actually written about it. It was the brothel was built, and the bad prisoners, the capos who were participating and supporting the Nazis, they were going there too. And so the subject was used, but used also against other people. So you can see it's highly political. And it was actually after the fall of the wall and after the unification that they put a marker there at the barracks and talk about the story of it. And even if you go on the website, you see the pictures even of the brothel. It does not happen in Sachsenhausen, for instance. So you can see it's even today, the taboo is still there. If you also look to camps on the western side, like Dachau, for instance, there's no mentioning at all. They're wanting to build a new exhibition. I think they mentioned it at some point, somewhere invisible. But there's no sign where the brothel stood. It's not only East German, it's also like Western German problem.
For descendants listening who might be related to these women, for the families of these women, what do you think is important for them to understand about their stories? A lot of listeners for this podcast, or a lot of people who are descendants, were looking for, like, how did this happen to my family member? Why didn't I know about this for so long? How can I find more information about this? And I'm just wondering what message you would give a family of those descendants in recognition of, like, why would it have been so hard until maybe even now to even recognize what happened to these women?
Who wants to have a prostitute in your family? Who wants to be like the child of a prostitute? Even like today, it's the most stigmatized thing ever. If you think about in your family biography, if you have somebody who is like a social outsider, it's already bad. You always have the black sheep in the family. So on one hand side, you have this kind of stigmatization of prostitution generally. On the other side, you also have the Nazi history. And I can give you an example. I'm working together with a woman from Australia. Her grandmother, she was in a brothel in Buchenwald. She wants to get a stumbling block for her. She wants to put the stumbling block where she used to live in Cuxhaven in the north of Germany. And we're working together. I support her as much as I can possibly do to do the stumbling block because I think it's very important that she's remembered. I also see how difficult it is in a family. I've never seen any family which says, oh, that's easy, let's do it. No, it's always difficult because some people in the family say, oh, I don't want to have this kind of dark shadow over the family. It's a bad reputation we get through that because it's still like morally not acceptable. So in this case, in her case, it's like half of the family is against it and half of the family is pro it. And it's really hard for herself even like to accept it because also she is a descendant from that woman. And so we're trying to like put a stumbling block in Cuxhaven. She does not put on a stumbling block that she was in a brothel. She's going to be remembered as a victim of Buchenwald, of the Nazis, but not as a victim inside of the brothel. I have mixed feelings about it because I think it should be sad. But on the other side, we should also see her as a victim of the Nazi regime. And I think even maybe this is the more important thing. And maybe this is also what I would suggest to people. See your member of your family who for any reason was sent to a concentration camp or tortured by the Nazis as a victim. There's no acceptable reason why they should send a person to a concentration camp and treat him so badly. So even if that person is a black sheep in the family, you still have to see that as a victim of the Nazi state and has to acknowledge that.
Thank you. That's really helpful because it's just taken so long to even recognize the dynamic. It's taken 80 years to recognize how the whole system worked, that these women got stuck, and to have the full picture of them as a victim. Are there any moments in your research that changed your understanding of the camps more broadly? Were there any surprises there or things that you went in with one assumption and then you ended up discovering an entirely new dynamic?
The subject itself already is a new dynamic. I never thought it would be possible. I never thought of that the Nazis would ever think of like creating an incentive system inside of the camp. But when I went more to details and understood how sexuality worked and how this whole system of terror even went inside of the camp brothels, the brothel wasn't excluded from the camp. It was just a part of the camp. So the organization of the camp brothels followed the camp rules. And that was so surprising for me, seeing even like at this very private world, a very personal and intimate world, we still have the rules of the camp. I also understood the functioning of the camp system myself much, much better through studying it. In my book, even like there's a whole introduction to the camp system, which is needed because so many things you don't know about the camp system. People always, for instance, they don't even know that Jews were always a minority in the camp system. Things like that. People always think a camp was used for killing people, like a concentration camp for killing people. It was, but it was not only. This changed everything. But I think what really struck me, really how human beings can be like dehumanized by just taking away their sexuality and their emotions, ability to have emotions. And that is something which totally struck me. And I think also when I talk to people, especially young people, I find them deeply moved by the subject because it's a lot of young people. They have their access to sexuality for the first time in their lifetime. And it's very important. It's just part of your life, or maybe the most important part of your life. And seeing how this is misused, how this is exploited and this is used against people, it's just so shocking. But I also think this really shows you the entire dimension of the concentration camp. To understand how evil Nazis were, how extreme the system was, and how it destroyed the human existence, this subject really shows how it did.
Are there any areas of this topic that still need more research or public awareness?
I think that the subject generally needs more public awareness. We need more kind of a commemoration of women. We need the mentioning and the inclusion of women into the memory. So I think what's happening now in Sachsenhausen is very important. I see it in other camps, like for instance, concentration camp memorials like Ravensbrück, where people are very active, survivors, but also political groups are very active. And there's actually the first memorial ever for women in a concentration camp brothel was actually built in Ravensbrück. So it totally makes sense. And I think this is important. It's important that we talk about it. When guides lead to a concentration camp memorial and talk about the history of it, very often the subject is left out, and it should not be left out. I know it's hard. I know it's very complex. You open like kind of an entire new book and you can talk for hours about it. But it's important to mention it. And it's important not only because of the subject generally, but also because the women are otherwise forgotten. And we should not forget these women. 220 women is the number of women who were forced into prostitution in the entire camp brothel system. But still, these women have to be remembered. So we have to be aware that these women have to be part of our memory. And again, even if there were black sheep, and even if there's some things which are not black and white but gray, but they still were victims of the Nazis. And to understand how the Nazis did this, and also to make sure that this will never happen again, it's our duty to talk about it.
Thank you so much for those words. Visiting the camp today, going to the Sachsenhausen Memorial today, I personally find it striking, having spent 3 years visiting that memorial, walking to see as many exhibits as I can. It's very difficult to find the mention of even a single woman prisoner in that camp. So I do agree that it's about time, 81 years later, that we mention some of their names and specifically mention this within the camp dedicated to victimizing women. Thank you so much for your research.
If you ever visit the Sachsenhausen Memorial, you should have a guide. You should ask the guide about it, face them with that subject, because otherwise they will not talk about it. And that's the thing. It's a grassroots thing we do. We have to fight for their acceptance. And it's very important that this subject is known, the names are known, the first names of the women are known. So we actually give them back their dignity.
Yeah, and if it takes 81 years for these women to be recognized, imagine what's happening today and how long it might take. Understand that dynamic. Hopefully it doesn't take another 81 years to figure that out. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure getting this time with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Descendant Stuff podcast is produced by Jakob Feistauer, Kelsey Snook, and Nicole Wines, 3 descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners and co-creators of the Sachsenhausen Stuff project. The Descendant Stuff team would like to extend a special thank you to the team at Sachsenhausen Memorial and Museum, especially Dr. Astrid Lai and the members of the Educational Department's project, What Voice Do We Have?, as well as the Descendants Collective Voices of the Next Generation. The theme song, Heil Sachsenhausen, was written by Alexander Kulisiewicz while he was imprisoned at Sachsenhausen and performed by him after the war. It is used with permission from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Kulisiewicz collection. If you are a Sachsenhausen descendant who would like to share your story, please contact us through our website at www.sachsenhausen-stuff.com or use the Contact Us link in the show notes below.
Heil Sachsenhausen. A jak będę jutro wzdychał lewą nóżką, ci zawtikam. Heil, es lebe Gold, o Kampf.